somewhere over the jungles of New Guinea, at 30,000 feet, where the air is so thin that an unprotected man loses consciousness. In under 2 minutes, a single American aircraft was threading its way through a formation of enemy fighters, not running from them, not calling for help, threading through them. The pilot had already fired once. He fired again. A Japanese Zero spiraled downward, trailing a curtain of black smoke that hung in the tropical sky, like a question mark. Then he turned. He always turned back. That was the thing about this pilot that nobody could quite explain. He always went back for more, not out of recklessness, not out of fury, but with the quiet, almost surgical calm of a man doing something he was simply born to do. Nobody in Washington had heard his name yet. His commanding general had only recently taken notice. The newspapers hadn't found him. And back home in Poplar, Wisconsin, population barely a few hundred souls, a town so small it barely registered on regional maps. His mother was canning vegetables and his father was working the land, not yet knowing that their son was, at that precise moment, becoming the deadliest American fighter pilot in the entire history of aerial warfare. His name was Richard Bong, and this is his story. To understand why Richard Bong matters, why his story echoes across 8 decades of military history and aviation legend, you have to understand the world he stepped into, not the sanitized movie poster version of the Second World War, but the brutal, terrifying, logistically nightmarish reality of the Pacific Theater in 1942 and 1943. The war in the Pacific was unlike anything American military planners had prepared for. The distances alone were staggering. The Pacific Ocean covers roughly 63 million square miles, more than all the land masses on Earth combined. Fighting a war across those distances meant that every aircraft, every bullet, every gallon of aviation fuel had to be shipped thousands of miles before it could even be used. Supply lines stretched so thin that pilots sometimes flew missions knowing there might not be replacement parts if their aircraft took damage. The infrastructure was being built in real time, under fire, in some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. Dense equatorial jungle, volcanic islands, coral reefs, malarial swamps that kill men as efficiently as any enemy weapon. And then there was the enemy. The Japanese Zero, formerly designated the Mitsubishi A6M, was, in 1941 and into 1942, arguably the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world. It was light. It was agile. It could turn inside almost anything the Americans or the British could put against it. Its range was extraordinary. And the men who flew it, especially in the early years of the war, were experienced, disciplined, battle-hardened veterans who had been flying combat missions over China since the late 1930s. When the Zero first appeared in significant numbers against American pilots, the results were catastrophic. American aviators who tried to dogfight the Zero on its own terms, turning and twisting, matching it move for move at low speed, died in enormous numbers. The tactics that worked in Europe, where American and British fighters faced a more structurally similar German Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, simply did not translate. By the summer of 1942, the situation in the Southwest Pacific was at a crisis point. American air power was outmatched tactically, outgunned in terms of experience, and fighting under conditions of constant material shortage. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, was under enormous pressure. He had made bold promises about retaking territory, about projecting power northward through New Guinea toward the Philippines, and ultimately toward Japan itself. But every one of those promises depended on achieving and maintaining air superiority over the region. And air superiority was exactly what the Americans did not have. The man MacArthur leaned on to solve this problem was a compact, intense, brilliantly inventive general named George Churchill Kenny. Kenny took command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific in August 1942, and he arrived to find a command that was, in his own blunt assessment, a mess. Aircraft were poorly maintained. Tactics were outdated. Morale was sagging under the weight of repeated losses. Kenny set about changing all of that with ferocity and creativity that would eventually make him one of the most celebrated air commanders of the war. He developed new attack profiles. He pioneered skip bombing, a technique where medium bombers flew at mass height and skipped bombs into the sides of enemy ships like a stone skipping across water. He demanded innovation, rewarded results, and had an almost preternatural ability to identify talent in unexpected places. It was this instinct for talent that would bring Kenny, eventually, to the attention of a certain quiet young pilot from Wisconsin. But not yet. First, that pilot had to find his way to the Pacific. And to do that, he first had to nearly get himself killed. Not by the Japanese, but by his own country's military bureaucracy and a very annoyed commanding officer in San Francisco. Richard Bong was born on September 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, the second of 9 children born to Carl and Dora Bong. His father was a Swedish immigrant who had built a modest life for his family as a farmer and logger in the northern Wisconsin countryside near the shore of Lake Superior. The landscape of his childhood was one of birch forests and frozen lakes, of long, silent winters and short, intense summers, of a kind of austere natural beauty that tends to produce either men of quiet introspection or men of restless physical energy. Richard Bong was somehow both. By any measure, his early life was ordinary to the point of invisibility. He was not a standout student, not a particularly vocal personality, not the kind of young man who drew the eye in a crowd. His school friends remembered him as friendly, modest to the point of shyness, and genuinely pleasant to be around, not qualities that typically signal the arrival of a military legend. He did his chores. He helped on the farm. He attended church. He was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of young man that history tends to pass right over. But there was one thing about Richard Bong that was anything but ordinary. From the time he was a small boy, he was obsessed with flight, not in a casual, stargazing way. Not in the way that many young men of his era admired aircraft the way they admired fast cars or exotic machinery. His obsession was specific, technical, and consuming. He read everything he could find about aviation. He built model aircraft from scratch with meticulous care. When a barnstormer flew into a nearby field offering $5 rides, young Richard found $5 somehow and climbed into that open cockpit with the eagerness of a man finally coming home. He was, from the very first moment he left the ground, a natural. Something happened to Richard Bong in the air that didn't happen anywhere else. The quiet, slightly awkward young man who seemed to disappear in crowd became, at altitude, something else entirely. Something precise, intuitive, alive with a kind of three-dimensional spatial awareness that most people simply do not possess. He earned his private pilot's license in 1938, paying for lessons with money. He earned working odd jobs and enrolled at Superior State Teachers College. Not because he burned with academic ambition, but because it kept him close enough to an airfield to keep flying. When the civilian pilot training program was established by the Roosevelt administration in 1939 to rapidly expand the pool of trained American aviators in anticipation of a war that was visibly approaching, Bong enrolled immediately. He was, his instructors noted, a singularly gifted student, not in the bookish, theoretical sense, but in the visceral, tactile, hand-and-eye sense that separates the merely competent pilot from a truly exceptional one. In May of 1941, with the war in Europe already raging and the situation in the Pacific growing darker by the month, Richard Bong enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He was 20 years old. He wanted to fly fighters. He was sent to train on fighters. And very quickly, almost everyone who flew with him or instructed him reached the same conclusion. This young man from Wisconsin had a gift that could not be taught, only recognized. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and received his wings in January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor had shattered American complacency and plunged the nation into a global war on 2 fronts. He was assigned to Hamilton Field near San Francisco, flying the Bell P-39 Airacobra, a capable but quirky aircraft with its engine mounted behind the pilot rather than in the nose, an unusual configuration that made a handle unlike anything else in the American inventory. It was at Hamilton Field that Richard Bong first came to the attention of his superiors. Unfortunately, it was not the kind of attention anyone hopes for. In a moment of exuberance that was entirely characteristic of both his personality and his skill, though perhaps not his judgment, Second Lieutenant Bong flew his P-39 down Market Street in San Francisco at rooftop level, not over the street, down the street, low enough, by multiple civilian accounts, that people on the upper floors of office buildings found themselves looking at the aircraft more or less horizontally. He then, according to the subsequent military investigation, and this detail has been confirmed by multiple sources, performed a series of loops around the Golden Gate Bridge. On a clear day, in a military aircraft, while presumably a great many people watched in a mixture of terror and wonder, he was immediately hauled before Brigadier General William Lind, who did not find the episode charming in the least. Bong was ordered, as part of his punishment, to personally apologize to a housewife whose clothesline he had reportedly disturbed with his low-level antics. Her freshly laundered sheets, according to the story, had been quite thoroughly disrupted by the prop wash of his aircraft. He was also ordered to fly a series of precision maneuvers before the general himself, to demonstrate that his airmanship was something more than reckless showboating. This was, it turned out, the most fortunate thing that could have happened to Richard Bong, because when he flew those precision maneuvers for General Lind, the general watched with the expression of a man slowly realizing that the problem standing before him is not quite the problem he thought it was. Bong flew with a perfection that was, to experienced eyes, unmistakably extraordinary. Lind referred him upward rather than washing him out. The talent was too obvious to waste. Shortly afterward, Bong was transferred to the 49th Fighter Group and began the journey that would take him to the Pacific, and to the aircraft that would become synonymous with his name. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was, in 1942, one of the most visually striking aircraft in any air force in the world. It looked like something out of a science fiction magazine. And indeed, when it first appeared, many observers literally could not believe what they were seeing. Twin engines, twin tail booms, a central pod housing the pilot's cockpit, and a nose bristling with 450 caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon. The armament was concentrated in the nose rather than in the wings, which meant that unlike wing-mounted guns that had to be harmonized to converge at a specific distance, the P-38's guns all fired in the same direction at the same point, directly in front of the aircraft, with devastating concentration. The P-38 had been developed in response to a 1937 Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour in level flight and climbing to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. Lockheed's response was revolutionary. The twin-engine design solved the problem of achieving that kind of performance without the weight and drag penalties that would have compromised a conventional single-engine layout. The aircraft was big by fighter standards, nearly 52 feet from wingtip to wingtip, but was also extraordinarily versatile. It could serve as an escort fighter, a bomber, a reconnaissance platform, and a ground attack aircraft. In the Pacific specifically, the P-38's range was almost more valuable than its combat performance. The distances over which pilots had to operate in the Pacific theater made range a matter of survival. The Zero had remarkable range for a carrier-based fighter, but the P-38, with its twin-engine efficiency and large fuel capacity, could match or exceed it under many conditions. This meant that American pilots flying the P-38 could escort bombers to targets that had previously been considered beyond detection range, and they could do so without arriving so low on fuel that combat became suicidal. There were weaknesses. The P-38 was challenging to fly, particularly in combat. Its size made it less maneuverable in tight-turning engagements than the nimble Zero, and its twin engines made engine-out emergencies significantly more complex. At high altitude in cold air, the early P-38 models suffered from compressibility problems when diving at high speed. The airflow over the wings would reach transonic speeds before the rest of the aircraft did, creating forces that could make the controls effectively lock up, sending the aircraft into a fatal dive with the pilot helpless to intervene. This problem killed a number of pilots before engineers developed the dive flaps that helped solve it, and its twin-engine configuration made it immediately identifiable at a distance. Japanese pilots knew the silhouette. They called it the two-tailed devil, and they respected it, which, in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat, was exactly what was needed. Richard Bong took to the P-38 as though it had been designed specifically for him, which, in a sense that transcends coincidence, it almost had been. General Kenny, who had by now taken full command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific and was in the process of rebuilding them from the ground up, had a philosophy about fighter pilots that he expressed with characteristic directness. He wanted hunters, not bureaucrats. He wanted men who would seek out the enemy, engage without hesitation, and return with results. Paperwork could be done by anyone. Killing enemy aircraft required a specific, rare, and largely unteachable combination of spatial intelligence, physical reflexes, emotional control, and what Kenny himself called the hunting instinct. When Bong's records and early performance reports reached Kenny's desk, Kenny looked at them for a long time. Then he asked to meet the pilot in person. What he found was, by all surviving accounts, not remotely what he expected. Richard Bong did not look like a killer. He looked, if anything, like someone who had wandered onto an air base looking for directions. He was 22 years old, blue-eyed, sandy-haired, with a face that retained a stubborn adolescent quality well into his military career. He spoke quietly. He didn't boast. When asked about his flying, he described it with matter-of-fact precision that sounded almost clinical. Technical observations about angles of attack and deflection, shooting and energy management, delivered in the flat vowels of northern Wisconsin without a trace of drama. He was, in the vocabulary of the era, just a kid. Kenny immediately recognized what he had. He had seen this quality before in the very best pilots. This quality of radical understatement, of calm where others were anxious, of clarity where others were confused. Bong wasn't describing his flying with false modesty. He genuinely didn't find it remarkable. That was the mark of true genius. What required profound conscious effort from other pilots was, for Bong, simply what happened when he got in an aircraft. Kenny assigned him to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, based out of airfields carved from New Guinea jungle, and told him to go hunting. The aerial war over New Guinea and the surrounding theater in 1942 and 1943 was a grinding, merciless campaign fought in conditions that tested every system, mechanical, logistical, and human, to its absolute limits. Malaria was so prevalent that at certain points more American airmen were in the hospital with disease than had been lost in combat. The heat and humidity rotted canvas, corroded metal, bred fungal infections in everything organic, and turned unpaved airstrips into treacherous mud within hours of rainfall. Aircraft that would have been considered well past their maintenance limits in any other theater were kept flying through sheer mechanical ingenuity, and the refusal of ground crews to accept what the manuals said was impossible. Into this environment came Second Lieutenant Richard Bong, who adapted to it with the same eerie equanimity that he applied to everything else. He didn't complain about the conditions. He flew every mission he was assigned. He flew additional missions when given the option, and in the air. The picture that emerged over the course of 1942 was one that made his fellow pilots, his commanding officers, and eventually Japanese aviators take very careful notice. Bong's approach to aerial combat was distinctive in a way that is easier to describe than it is to fully explain. Most fighter pilots of the era relied primarily on the deflection shot, leading a moving target the way a hunter leads a duck, firing where the aircraft was going to be rather than where it currently was. This required a complex series of calculations performed in real time under extreme physical and psychological stress, and executing it consistently was extraordinarily difficult. Even very good pilots missed deflection shots regularly. Bong preferred to get close. Very close. Uncomfortably, suicidally close, in the estimation of many observers. He had an almost uncanny ability to maneuver his P-38 into a position directly behind an enemy aircraft, closing the distance to ranges where deflection ceased to matter, where you simply pointed the nose of the target and fired. His maximum effective firing range was often under 100 yards, sometimes considerably under. He would occasionally describe, with that same flat Wisconsin calm, closing the distances where you could see the cockpit details of the aircraft he was about to destroy. The risk in this approach was obvious. Getting that close to an enemy aircraft meant exposure to its return fire, potential collision danger, and the very real possibility of being destroyed by the debris of a target you just shot down. Bong was hit by enemy fire on multiple occasions throughout his career. Debris from destroyed aircraft damaged his aircraft more than once. He regarded these incidents the way a dedicated farmer regards bad weather, an unwelcome inconvenience to be managed, not a reason to reconsider the fundamentals. His first aerial victory came on December 27, 1942, over New Guinea, when he shot down a Japanese Zero. It was, by his own description, not particularly dramatic. He had positioned himself correctly, closed his preferred range, and fired. The Zero caught fire and went down. He made a note in his records and flew back to base. By January 1943, he had 3 victories. By April 7, each one was recorded with the same methodical precision. Each one the result of the same fundamental approach: patience, positioning, and the terrifying intimacy of close-range fire. General Kenny was watching. He had begun to hear things from Bong's squadron that commanders don't often hear about junior pilots. Not stories of heroism in the movie poster sense, but something quieter and more impressive: consistency, reliability. A young man who went up and came back having done exactly what needed doing, every time, regardless of conditions or the odds, without drama and without failure. Kenny summoned Bong, promoted him, and gave him something that no other pilot in the theater had received: a kind of roving commission to fly wherever he chose, whenever he chose, in pursuit of enemy aircraft. He was, in effect, given permission to hunt without a fixed assignment. He could attach himself to any mission, any formation, any strike package that offered the opportunity for aerial combat. He could go looking for kills on days when other pilots were stood down. It was an extraordinary vote of confidence from a man not known for casual generosity, and Bong responded to it exactly as Kenny had expected he would. By the summer of 1943, his score had climbed through the teens. By October, he was approaching and then surpassing 20 victories, a milestone that placed him among the most accomplished fighter pilots in American history. At 20 victories, you were not merely a good pilot. You were a phenomenon. You were a statistical impossibility made flesh, a man who had been in 20 separate deadly aerial engagements against a skilled and determined enemy, and had come home from all of them, each time bringing one less Japanese aircraft with him. The press began to find him. This presented a problem that would have been, to almost any other pilot, a welcome one. Correspondents arrived at his airfield looking for color, for quotes, for the sort of swaggering charisma that made great war stories. They found a 23-year-old farm boy who spoke slowly, deflected questions with genuine puzzlement about why they were being asked, and seemed to find the entire enterprise of celebrity slightly baffling. He wrote long letters home to his mother. He wrote, with increasing frequency and evident emotion, to a young woman named Marge Vitendel, who lived in Superior, Wisconsin, and whom he had met before the war, and who had become, in the way that the war intensified everything, the emotional center of his life. Her photograph flew with him on every mission, a practice that became well known in his unit, and that he discussed with characteristic openness when asked, not as a romantic gesture performed for cameras, but because he genuinely drew something from it, something that anchored him. He talked about going home, not in a desperate, fearful way, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided something is going to happen and sees no reason to doubt it. He was going home. He was going to marry Marge. He was going to farm or fly, or do something that involved being in Wisconsin with the woman he loved. The war was a thing that needed finishing first. He intended to help finish it. On December 27, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after his first aerial victory, Richard Bong shot down his 27th Japanese aircraft. This placed him ahead of Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 aerial victories from the First World War, which had stood for 25 years as a definitive measure of American aerial achievement. Rickenbacker himself sent a congratulatory telegram. Kenny sent a case of whiskey. MacArthur, who had by now taken a genuine personal interest in the young pilot from Wisconsin, awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross. Bong accepted all of it with the same slightly bewildered equanimity. He thanked Rickenbacker sincerely in his reply. He shared the whiskey. He went back to flying. The world, at this point, was watching in a way it had not been before. War correspondents were filing dispatches. Newspapers in the United States were running front-page stories. The Army Air Forces, well aware of the propaganda value of having an active, living, still-flying ace who was already the most successful in American history, was both proud and anxious. Proud for obvious reasons. Anxious because the most successful fighter pilot in American history was still flying combat missions in one of the deadliest air combat environments in the war, and a statistical reality that nobody wanted to say out loud was hovering over every mission he flew. Extraordinary records in combat tend to end one of two ways. Kenny wrestled with the question of what to do with Bong throughout the first months of 1944. Ordering him home would be safe, would protect the investment, would preserve the living symbol. But Bong showed no interest in going home until the mission was done. He would accept being grounded between combat tours. He would accept the promotional work that the Army Air Forces wanted from him, and he would comply with whatever orders he was given. But he made his preference clear in the quiet, persistent way that was his most characteristic mode of expression. He wanted to fly. He wanted to keep the score moving. He was not finished. Kenny sent him back to the States briefly in early 1944, officially for rest and evaluation, more practically to remove him from immediate danger for a time and to let the publicity machine do its work. Bong made the rounds. He gave interviews with the same careful understatement that had always characterized his public persona. He visited training bases where young pilots, many of them barely older than he had been when he first joined up, watched him with something approaching religious reverence. He was 23 years old, and he was already a legend, and he handled it with a grace that was all the more remarkable for being completely unconscious. He also, during this leave, asked Margaret Tyndall to marry him. She said yes. He went back to the Pacific. The spring and summer of 1944 brought the war to a new phase. American industrial output was now crushing its Japanese counterpart in every measurable category. The Essex-class carriers were arriving in numbers that Japanese naval planners had not believed possible. The new Grumman F-6F Hellcat was demonstrating, in engagement after engagement, that the technological balance had shifted decisively. The Zero's advantages of agility and range were no longer enough to compensate for its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, and American pilots were no longer foolish enough to try to fight on its own terms. MacArthur's forces were advancing up the coast of New Guinea in a series of amphibious leaps, each one outflanking and isolating Japanese garrisons. The strategic momentum had shifted, but the individual combats were no less lethal for being part of a losing campaign on the Japanese side. In fact, there was an argument to be made that certain Japanese pilots, the veterans, the survivors, the men who had been flying combat since China in 1937 and 1938, were, by 1944, fighting with particular intensity born of the knowledge that they were running out of time and replacements. These men were dangerous in a way that the newer Japanese pilots, who were being rushed through abbreviated training programs to fill the catastrophic losses of 1942 and 1943, simply were not. They were desperate, they were experienced, and they were perfectly capable of killing you if you gave them the chance. Bong gave them very few chances. Through the spring and into the summer of 1944, his score climbed, 30, 32, 35, each number representing an engagement that had, somewhere over a Pacific island or jungle or ocean, ended with a Japanese aircraft destroyed, and its pilot dead or bailing out or burned. The accumulating total was, in the mathematical language of military history, simply staggering. No American pilot in the First World War had reached 30. No American pilot in the European theater had come close to 35. Bong was now flying in territory that had no precedent in American military history. General Kenny, by now as fond of Bong as a man of his disposition, was capable of being fond of anyone, issued a standing order that Bong was to fly as an observer on any missions beyond his 35th kill. He was prohibited, officially, from actively engaging enemy aircraft. He was there to learn, Kenny said, to evaluate, to teach. This order lasted approximately as long as it took for Richard Bong to spot a Japanese aircraft. Kenny, told afterward the engagements, appears to have responded to each one with a mixture of exasperation and barely concealed delight that was, given the circumstances, probably the most appropriate possible response. By October 1944, as MacArthur's forces returned to the Philippines in the invasion of Leyte, an operation that fulfilled MacArthur's famous "I shall return" promise, and that represented one of the pivotal moments of the entire Pacific War, Richard Bong's score stood at 38, too short of 40, too short a number that, in the minds of military aviation enthusiasts and historians, would stand as a definitive American record for all time. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought between October 23 and 26, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved, and the air campaign that surrounded it was correspondingly enormous. Japanese air power, recognizing that the loss of the Philippines would represent an essentially mortal blow to Japan's strategic position, threw enormous resources into contesting it. The skies over Leyte and the surrounding waters were, for several days, among the most contested in the entire war. Bong flew into them. Victory number 39 came in October, during the opening phases of the Philippine campaign, in a combat that was, by available accounts, characteristic of every engagement he had ever fought, precise, controlled, and decisive. He identified the target. He maneuvered for position. He closed to close range. He fired. The Japanese aircraft went down. And then on October 28, 1944, at roughly 1,500 meters altitude over Leyte, pursuing a Japanese aircraft with a broken cloud that characterizes tropical convective weather, Richard Bong shot down his 40th enemy aircraft. 40. The number settled over the Pacific Theater, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Kenny, when a confirmed report reached him, reportedly sat quietly for a moment before speaking. MacArthur called it, with his characteristic gift for the dramatic phrase, one of the most extraordinary individual achievements in the history of aerial warfare. Rickenbacker, whose record Bong had now nearly doubled, sent another message, warmer this time, the message of one extraordinary pilot to another across the gulf of the years between them. Bong himself, asked how it felt to have 40 kills, reportedly said something along the lines of, "It feels about the same as 39. This was not performance. This was not false modesty calculated to seem appealing. This was Richard Bong. The score existed because enemy aircraft needed to be destroyed. They had been destroyed. The number was a reflection of work completed, not a monument to personal achievement. He went back to his bunk and wrote a letter to Marge. Kenny now did what he had been preparing to do for months. He pulled Bong from combat, formally, permanently, and sent him home, not as a punishment, not as a bureaucratic decision, as the act of a commanding general who understood, with absolute clarity, that some things are too valuable to risk for marginal additional gain, and that Richard Bong's continued presence in the combat zone was now, regardless of his personal wishes, a liability that no responsible commander could sustain. Bong accepted this with the same quiet grace he brought to everything. He had 40 kills. He had his record. He had his promise to Marge, still waiting in Wisconsin. And the truth was, though he would not have said it in these terms, that he was tired, not the ordinary tiredness of a man who needs sleep, the deeper exhaustion that accumulates in anyone who has spent 2 years making the kinds of decisions that aerial combat demands, thousands of feet above the earth, with death arriving without warning at velocities that make conscious reaction impossible. He returned to the United States to a welcome that might have overwhelmed a man of lesser equilibrium. There were parades. There were presidential announcements. There was a ceremony in January 1945 at which General MacArthur, in a manner that was somewhat irregular by normal military protocol, pinned the Medal of Honor on Bong personally. The citation acknowledging his extraordinary record and his conspicuous gallantry throughout the Pacific campaign. Bong stood at attention and received it with the expression of a man attending a ceremony he would rather have missed. He and Marge Attendle were married on February 10th, 1945, in Poplar, Wisconsin. The farm boy from the birch forest on the shores of Lake Superior, the boy who had built model aircraft and dreamed of the sky, brought his bride home in the middle of the deadliest war in human history and married her in the community where he had been born. It was, by all accounts, a joyful occasion. Simple, warm, genuine, entirely without pretension. Marge wore a white dress. Richard wore his uniform. His family was there. His friends from childhood were there. Nobody thought about aerial kill records. For a brief, golden window of weeks, Richard Bong was simply a young man in love, married to the woman he had carried in his heart across 2 years of combat, living the life he had promised himself he was going to live. The Army, meanwhile, had plans for him. He was assigned to test fly the Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, the aircraft that was intended to transform American air power in the same way the gas turbine was transforming every other form of transportation. The P-80 was everything the piston-engine fighters that Bong had flown were not. No propeller, jet exhaust thundering from the tail, acceleration that felt, to pilots encountering jet power for the first time, like something from another world. It was significantly more complex to fly, demanded new techniques and new instincts, and was like all cutting-edge aircraft being pushed into a performance envelope, capable of killing its pilot in ways that were still being discovered. Bong took to jet flying with predictably exceptional ability. He had a gift for new aircraft that went beyond mere competence. He absorbed the differences, adapted his technique, and was evaluating performance envelopes that other test pilots approached with more caution. There were some who worried about this. Some who felt that a pilot of Bong's experience and instinct could, in a jet aircraft still being understood, push past the margins without quite recognizing where the margins were. The P-80, in particular, had a fuel system that behaved differently from anything in Bong's experience, with an engine start sequence that required precise attention to specific parameters during a phase of flight, takeoff, when pilot attention was by necessity divided. On August 6, 1945, Richard Bong was killed. He was test flying AP-80 at Lockheed's facility at Burbank, California. The aircraft suffered a fuel system malfunction during takeoff. The engine flamed out during a critical phase of flight, when the aircraft was too low and too slow for any corrective action to be effective. The aircraft hit the ground, and Bong, who had begun to exit the cockpit but was unable to complete the egress before impact, was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. Marge Bong, 24 years old herself, a bride of less than 6 months, learned of her husband's death on the day that the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a day so saturated with history that the passing of one man, however extraordinary, was submerged beneath the weight of the larger event. History moved forward in those days with a terrifying speed, and individual stories were swept along in it. But the story of Richard Bong was not lost. It couldn't be. The numbers were too significant, the record too unambiguous, the character too unusual. 40 aerial victories. This is and remains the all-time record for an American military pilot. In the 81 years since his death, no American combat aviator has come close to matching it. The nature of modern air warfare, with its emphasis on beyond visual range missiles, network situational awareness, and increasing involvement of unmanned systems, makes it effectively certain that no one ever will. Richard Bong's record is not just the current American record. It is, in all likelihood, the permanent American record. The tactical lessons Bong demonstrated influence American fighter doctrine in ways that are still traceable in how the United States Air Force approaches aerial combat training. His emphasis on energy management, on using the P-38's superior speed and climb rate to dictate the terms of engagements rather than trying to match the zero in turning fights, anticipated the energy maneuverability theories that were formally articulated by fighter pilot and theorist John Boyd decades later. Bong wasn't a theorist. He didn't write papers or give lectures. But what he did instinctively, Boyd later explained mathematically, and what the United States Air Force subsequently built into the foundational curriculum of its Top Gun-style fighter weapon schools. General Kenney, writing years after the war, described Bong in terms that have been quoted and requoted ever since, not because they are particularly florid, but because they carry the weight of first-hand testimony from one of the most perceptive air commanders in American history. Kenney had seen many pilots. He had seen all the aces. He said flatly that Richard Bong was simply the best fighter pilot he had ever seen, and that he doubted he would see another one like him. The town of Poplar, Wisconsin, which barely registers on most maps, has not forgotten. There's a memorial there. There's a museum bearing his name in Superior, Wisconsin, the city where he grew up and where the P-38 Lightning that carries his name, the aircraft that was his weapon and his instrument, and, in a way that is not entirely metaphorical, an extension of his will, is preserved and displayed. People come to see it from across the country and from across the world. They stand before the twin-boom silhouette and try to imagine what it was like to sit inside it, 40,000 feet above the Pacific, hunting. Marge Bong, Marge Vitendel, the girl from Superior whose photograph flew on every one of those 40 missions, eventually remarried, raised a family, and lived a long life. She never stopped talking about Dick, never stopped answering questions about him, never stopped receiving visitors, never stopped sharing the story of a quiet, extraordinary young man from the Wisconsin countryside who loved her and loved flying, and did both of those things with the same uncomplicated, wholehearted devotion. And perhaps that is, finally, the most important thing to understand about Richard Bong. Not the 40 kills, not the Medal of Honor, not the record that will never be broken. The most important thing is a combination. The man who could be absolutely deadly at 30,000 feet and absolutely gentle on the ground, who could destroy 40 enemy aircraft in 2 years of combat and write tender letters home without any apparent difficulty reconciling these two activities, because for him there was nothing to reconcile. He was a warrior the way some people are musicians, not because they have been trained to be, not because they have made a philosophical choice to embrace it, but because the talent was simply there, whole and coherent from the very beginning. The war needed killing. He did the killing. The war ended. He wanted to come home and farm and love his wife and watch his children grow up in the northern Wisconsin countryside where the birches grow along the cold shores of Lake Superior. He got the killing part right, all 40 times. He just didn't get enough of the rest. That is a particular grief of his story, not the grief of waste, because Richard Bong accomplished more in 24 years than most men accomplish in 80, but the grief of interruption, the grief of a story that was still going somewhere beautiful when it was cut off, the grief of 41, which never came. History sometimes measures greatness by what people leave behind. But the truest measure of Richard Bong's life might be found in what he was reaching toward. The ordinary Wisconsin morning. The smell of the lake, Marge's hand in his. The long, quiet years still ahead. He never got there. But God, how close he came. If a story like this one does something to you, if it makes you feel the weight of real sacrifice behind the numbers and the records and the facts and textbooks, then you already understand why this channel exists. Because real history is not a collection of dates. It is a collection of human beings who made choices and paid prices and left impressions on the world that we are still living inside of, whether we know it or not. Richard Bong paid a price, and we owe him, at minimum, the attention of genuinely understanding what he did and who he was. If this video moved you or taught you something or made you look at that era differently, please take a moment to hit the like button. It sounds small, but on YouTube it is genuinely the thing that tells the algorithm this story is worth putting in front of more people, and stories like this one deserve to be heard. Every like is a vote for real history over entertainment history. And if you want to keep receiving stories like this, the ones that didn't make the big budget movies, the ones that got filed away in military archives and regimental histories and deserve better, then subscribe to WWII Ghost Wings. We are here for exactly these stories. The unsung ones. The ones where the hero is a quiet farm boy who nobody expected anything from, right up until the moment he changed everything. One question before you go, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. Is there a pilot, a soldier, a sailor, from any side, any nation, any theater of the Second World War, whose story you think deserves the same treatment as Richard Bong's? Someone the history books barely mention, whose name you think more people should know? Leave it below. Some of our best future episodes have come directly from comments on videos exactly like this one. Your answers matter. Next time on WWII Ghost Wings, a story that begins in the frozen darkness over Berlin, with a bomber crew who had already been written off as lost and a lone American fighter pilot who defied every standing order, turned back into enemy territory alone, and did something that military historians still cannot fully explain. That story is coming. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about the real history. And thank you for being part of this community. We will see you for the next one.